Hi everyone. Thank you for joining in the afternoon after having listened to all the previous presentation. I hope you still have a bit of attention for me. I'll try to make it interesting. I'm coming to you today to present a paper we recently authored at the Open Source Observatory from the European Commission, which is studying the progress and trends in the national open source policies and legal frameworks. My name is Axel Thévenet. I'm a policy advisor at Open Forum Europe, and today I'm representing the Open Source Observatory of the European Commission. In this presentation, I'll just quickly introduce what is OSOR, and what do we do in terms of analysis of open source policy. Then we will review the key drivers that have basically been motivating the adoption of open source policy in various member states of the EU and also outside of the EU. And finally, we will look at the implementation strategies that have been deployed by member states, but also by cities, regions, and international organizations to manage to implement open source in these organizations. But to start, so for those that don't know, the Open Source Observatory is a platform that's been existing for 15 years now. There you can find free and open source software news and events that we are writing about, as well as a knowledge center with various reports, guidelines, research papers, and case studies. We also try to organize community events every now and then, workshops, webinars, and so on to discuss the most urgent or current problems or interesting points around open source software in the public sector. And finally, our latest milestones so far have been our OSOR Awards. For the 15 years of the platform last year, we celebrated it with awards that gave a reward to various projects that we deemed the most interesting in the public sector and that were also voted in by the community as the most interesting or just, we also published a handbook about open source in public administrations to help public servants and just public administration in general to use open source. And finally, we're also organizing a workshop around FOSSEPS, the free and open source software in the European public sector project from the European Parliament. But the report I'm talking about today, or the paper, is basically the conclusion of way more research. So as you can see, we've had various reports that have been published on the platform. The first one actually dates back to 2016. The second one from 2019, 2020, and the one I'm talking about is from last year, from 2023, and we're still continuing the research. Every year we try to publish these country reports which are trying to give an overview of the state of open source adoption in a country. It describes the policymakers, the strategic players, the legal frameworks in place, as well as the most important open source software initiatives in that country. And so in this paper we tried to get an idea of the evolution of open source policy, what are the new trends, how has it been implemented, and we try to give a qualitative analysis of 16 European and non-European countries. It's mostly based around the reports that we wrote in the last years, and to try to examine this motivation and implementation strategies, like I said before. And so to dive in directly, here are the three main drivers identified. So you heard a lot about digital sovereignty just a few minutes ago, so I'm not going to try and explain too much about that, but between digital sovereignty, transparency, and crisis response, these are the three main motives that have been driving adoption in most of these countries. When I'm thinking of digital sovereignty, there's various forms of digital sovereignty. First, there was a first wave around the 2010s. I'm thinking of external countries like Bolivia, China, or Mexico, that have started mentioning digital sovereignty as a motive to use open source, as a way to try and get away from the overseeing of other states. And more recently in the EU, since the 2015s, we've had countries like Sweden, or now as well Germany and France, explicitly mentioning digital sovereignty as a reason why they would like to use open source tools instead of proprietary ones. The fact that this is mentioned and that is now in the public discourse, in the public speech, is an evolution, and it's pretty recent, but we are also still seeing an evolution in the definition itself. For transparency, I'm thinking of other countries here, from the Netherlands. I don't know if anyone of you come from the Netherlands, but there's a strong focus on transparency there, and there's one policy in particular, the open unless policy, that's been enacted now a couple years ago, which obligates the states basically to try and make anything open unless there's the rightful reasons not to do so. You might say rightful reasons can be very large, and sometimes they are, but coupled with another legislation, the Open Government Act, which requests the full disclosure of information from the government. These two policies have enabled the state to basically push for more open source, but also disclosure of source code. One of the main cases of this was the case of Logius, which is a software developed by one of the government agencies, of which a snapshot of the code was disclosed after a request under the Open Government Act. And finally, the last big political motive that was used to drive open source adoption has been crisis response and the efficiency of development of open source software, basically. If we think about the COVID-19 crisis or the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, it's two major cases where open source software developers and just civic society in general have came in and supported governmental infrastructures to support citizens. For COVID, we've had apps, protocols, and different systems that have been developed as open source to be able for member states to communicate together and create a proper tracing systems of contamination, but also vaccination that were very useful and important to make sure that most people would be getting this information. And for the Ukraine conflict, with the massive refugee influx from Ukraine to the neighboring countries, there were dire needs for information on how to pass the border, on how to be able to find housing. And there we've seen new applications being developed, either by civic society or in collaboration with states, to be able to help the people at a moment where they really needed it. But so, after looking at all these drivers and all these political motives that's been now pushed in the last years, we've also seen an evolution of implementation strategies. And yes, first at the national level, the main evolution that we've seen is that member states, or just states in general, government, have become more and more understanding of what is open source, even though we're still not there. There's been an evolution from first policies that were mandating the use of open source in certain countries, or in certain cases, which were often not very effective because they weren't followed up with proper implementation strategies or proper enforcement strategies, no training to civil servants, or not the right solution. And now we are seeing more and more the evolution towards collaborative approaches. And as part of that, for example, we see the rise of open source program offices. For a very long time, mostly we've seen them in the private sectors, but as of now, we have more and more OSPOs being created in the EU as well as outside the EU in various agencies. You've heard of people today that are part of OSPOs at national level or at the agency levels. And these structures have greatly helped to facilitate the implementation of certain open source tools at government level, whether it's just a messaging app or a stronger collaborative suite like, for example, La Suite or Zendis that you've heard of today. We also see more bottom-up collaboration. Here I'm going to take the example of Czechia. There was Jiri Manek that was here just before that was talking about open cities. I don't know if it was in this room, but for example, they've been collaborating a lot with the Czech government for the government code repository maintenance. And their efforts have been helping this government to be able to use open source in a more effective way and to also just share what they do in terms of software to a wider audience. It's also similar in France. The DINUM in its free software mission, the Mission Logiciel Libre, have been creating the Free Software Council, which is gathering stakeholders from the private sector, from the civil society, citizens association, and as well governmental actors that are able to discuss together and to help advise on future strategies or just on the use of open source software. And finally, member states have also understood that there was a dire need to work on the infrastructure security. I saw earlier today on a presentation the I Love You security risk, but the one that really traumatized a lot of governments was the Log4Shell. And since then, we've seen a lot more initiatives to try to basically work around these problems. And now we have, for example, in Germany, the German Sovereign Tech Fund that's trying to fund maintenance and to support critical infrastructure components, so critical software blocks and so on, to make sure governments are ready to fight back on these different problems. At cities and regions level, we also see different implementation and an evolution of those. Cities and regions shouldn't be overlooked. They're very important in the use of open source software in public sector. They're massive number of users. And because of that, they have also a large power to push for adoption, but only when they're grouped. As a single municipality, it's very difficult to do a lot. So we've seen a lot of evolution towards collective IT development and resource pooling. There's a few examples I want to take two. It's the ADULACT in France and IMIO in Belgium. These two are associations that are made with and for cities and municipalities to together develop software packages or just software that can be used inside many of the cities and municipalities and reused, and to make sure they have some control over what's happening. These are very effective. The cities that have been able to be part of this project are implementing open source solutions inside of their digital infrastructures, and we see through them a lot of reuse. There's also, at a more individual level, at a more municipal level, when they're not part of associations, municipality just integrating very popular open source software. I'm thinking of Decidim, but there's also a lot not only about participatory democracy, but also about mobility. The Fix My Street, for example like this, where very field-specific solutions are being reused around different municipalities. And finally, there's support from associative networks. And here, it's not only as an association that do resource pooling, but just associative network working with municipalities to help them, not as part of them or not with municipalities as member, but just providing potential software to them and helping to see what are the needs and how to basically fulfill them. And finally, looking at the European and international initiatives, we also see an evolution there. You might have heard of the Sustainable Development Goals. As part of these goals, open source has been identified as a way to help achieve those. So the UN has been promoting directly open source as a means to achieve its goals, and therefore has been motivating international audience and countries to work on this and to try and collaborate on this. We see similar kind of effects with the digital commons concept. So this one is also reused at international level. It's also used as a diplomatic tool. We've seen the EU, for example, using their input and their efforts to create digital commons as a way to push for more diplomatic resolution or just a dialogue with certain countries. And we're seeing basically reuse of software around the world from one country to another, or from different countries to other countries. And finally, we also see big communities. I'm thinking here of the OSGeo community, because they've been able to see their solution adopted almost not everywhere, but on every continent, and to have also gathered enough developers a bit everywhere in the world to have collaboration with countries from various places, various international organizations, and just basically impose themselves as a very useful solution and a very efficient one to create global collaboration around common standards. And so all of that together kind of summarizes what we observed. So for basically what we conclude out of this is that we saw a big shift towards more comprehensive ecosystem approaches. By that, what we mean is basically that governments are more aware of what open source is than 10 years ago. They don't take it as just something they can take and put on the table and use, but they understand more and more, even though it's not perfect, and it will take time. How to also sustain the ecosystem and not only to take from it, but also to contribute to it. There's also a clearer importance given to collaboration with stakeholders. We see some governments being able now to purposefully communicate with the open source stakeholders and communities and to actually help nurture them, but also see how they can be helped and help each other. And finally, while sovereignty, transparency, and implementation strategies differ, there's a real surge in activities around open source policy. And while there's no balance yet, these definitions and so on are slowly getting stabilized. And we might see, we hopefully want to see in the next years, even more progress on this. I don't know exactly what's my time, and I don't think there's time for questions. But I'm happy to answer any. If you have any question about this, please feel free to reach out. This is the email address to reach out to. Feel free to reach out to Ozor. Basically, we're very happy to talk with you and to always answer any questions, to direct you to more pieces or more news article or case study we wrote. And yeah, thank you for your time.